President Trump taking another swipe at GM and Mary Barra, taking to Twitter saying, quote, very disappointed with General Motors and their CEO, Mary Barra, for closing plants in Ohio and Michigan and Maryland, nothing being closed in Mexico and China. The U.S. saved General Motors, and this is the thanks we get. We are now looking at cutting all GM subsidies, including for electric cars. General Motors made a big China bet years ago when they built plants there and in Mexico. Don't think that bet is going to pay off. I am here to protect America's workers. Patrick Anderson, CEO at Anderson Economic Group, joins us now from East Lansing, Michigan. Patrick, you work with the auto industry all the time in Michigan and elsewhere. Is the president right? Should we do away with subsidies for GM and all the other automakers?
Well, the electric car subsidy is already a pretty weak subsidy in terms of helping automakers. And by the way, General Motors is going to run through their allocation of $200,000 by the end of the year. So that's kind of a silly thing to say, actually. However, it is a good question about whether we should be subsidizing electric cars in general. Part of what our analysis shows is that electric and hybrid cars are still only about 3% of the U.S. market, even with a subsidy. So if we're looking at maintaining employment and maintaining U.S. leadership in manufacturing, really right now electric cars is a very small fraction of the market, and the president, in threatening to take away that, is really not threatening to do a whole lot.
Well, then wouldn't this just be a political ploy then? Because you have this situation where Tesla has already hit that almost 200,000 threshold, and the fact that the president can threaten to remove these subsidies when already you're saying that they're not that valuable and GM is coming close to that. Really, is this like the president saying, I'm going to be tough right now, but really it has no effect?
I don't think the president's rhetoric here is particularly important in terms of looking at the industry or what General Motors did. General Motors had to take action. Their sales were slumping. We've been looking at the models here. The models that they selected in these plants have been slumping. They have excess capacity. Their choice is either repeat the mistakes of the 80s and 90s and threaten themselves into bankruptcy again, or take action. And I, even as somebody who knows the pain that's going to happen in my home state of Michigan over some of these plant closings, I'd rather see them take action now than go bankrupt again.
Well, and really, the question here is who is General Motors accountable to? Is General Motors accountable to something that may look politically good or politically bad, or are they accountable to their shareholders? Now, if General Motors is going to do what's in the best interest of their shareholders, it looks like this was the right move. And if they do what's in the best interest of their shareholders, the company is more likely to prosper and be around, which means that jobs won't be lost. If they make decisions that are not honoring their fiduciary duty, in the end, American workers get harmed because the company goes down.
I'd say generally that's completely true, not just for the auto industry, but for others. And I would add, it's not in the interest of the employees for General Motors management to ignore sales trends, to keep them working to build cars that are not selling now, and hide from them the reality. The one thing everyone in the auto industry knows is that there will not be another bailout of the auto industry. And in this particular situation, even though, again, I know exactly where some of these plants are, particularly the Hamtramck Detroit plant, it's going to be painful in Detroit. I'd rather that General Motors was around selling cars and selling it through American dealers and making American suppliers active and profitable than ignoring what's happening in the market. And I'm pleased, actually, to see General Motors taking a leadership position. Even if all these decisions turn out to be not entirely correct, maybe they misjudged some models or chose the wrong plants, or some of them. The fact is, as the data we're looking at shows, that sales in these models are declining, the U.S. economy is cooling, and everyone in the auto industry knows that sooner or later there's a downturn and people stop buying cars. It's one of the first things people do when a recession is approaching is stop buying cars, and you do not want to have a factory lot full of cars you can't sell when that happens.
Patrick, I don't think anybody expects General Motors to manufacture a model of a car that nobody wants to buy. I don't think that's really the basis of criticism. Here's what I find shocking, and I'll be curious to hear what you think. The president knew about this. It's not like he saw the press release yesterday, and I know that because I know he was getting letters from Congressman Ryan from the Youngstown area concerned about Lordstown. I know that he had a conversation with Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio. The president knew about this. Wouldn't you anticipate that a president who is as concerned about these jobs as he says would have already been in discussions with GM, not threatening them today with stuff that I think you and I both agree is silly talk, but already in conversations with them saying, what's it going to take to get you to bring that model that you're making in Mexico and retool in Lordstown so that we keep those jobs here? Isn't that what you would expect?
I think it's a little much to expect elected officials to be inside the thinking of every American company, even a company as large as important as General Motors. But he knew. He wasn't inside
the thinking. He knew.
Well, I think you're expecting him to have more knowledge than a U.S. elected official typically has. And I'll say also for these congressmen and senators, they, of course, want to maintain employment in their plants. So do mayors. So do other businesses like my business. I'd like to see more employment in these areas and more automobiles built in these areas. However, General Motors had the inside information. I've got some of it here. I mean, you actually didn't need a briefing with a senator. You could have looked at these sales trends and known that you can't keep producing the Impala, the CT6, the XT4, and continue to have the production schedule you had because those sales are declining. And if you read through General Motors' decision, they're not just saying we're going to reduce the production at these plants and these models. They're saying we're shifting to where the market is going and where they're stronger.
Right.
And as a whole, I would rather they did that than go bankrupt again.
And Larry, aren't we also looking at...
John,
Aren't we shifting production, though? If we're shifting where cars are being sold, you're shipping it to China, right? Because you're building plants in China. The president says you've lost that bet on China. That's not true. GM now produces more cars in China than they produce in the United States. And it seems to me with these tariff talks, with this trade war, with this talk about reducing subsidies and going after American business, that is just going to get worse because right now it appears to me that Americans have lost the ability to export cars because we're just building cars overseas for overseas use. Is that right?
I don't think Americans have lost the ability to build cars or export them. In fact, if you look not only at General Motors, but I think the example A here is Chrysler, Fiat Chrysler Group, where their main business strategy right now is to export Jeeps to other countries. And their new CEO is spearheading that. The China operation for General Motors is integrated to some extent with the rest of the company, but that is really largely separate. They build different cars in different plants. There's very little crossover of assembled vehicles. There's some now, but they're still very small. Fortunately, what you see with Ford and GM, and to a lesser extent Chrysler, is the models that they are continuing are now very good in their marketplace. If you look at trucks, if you look at these crossovers, if you look at some of the sedans that are remaining, you do in fact see, in sport cars you see, Ford, GM, Chrysler being at the top of the market or near it. And that's what we need, competitive models that customers want.
Patrick, I'm sorry to cut you off. We got to leave it at that. But next time you come back, I want to ask you if Chrysler is really an Italian car company. But that's for another day. Thank you very much for being with us, Patrick.